What's up everyone, Eber here with Hardware Canucks, and this is the new Razer Blade Stealth, more particularly the 2019 edition. Now the word stealth really does reflect the product design Razer's going for in the first place, because when you look at this notebook from every possible angle, it doesn't show anything aggressive, but rather it's very low profile, but it packs some interesting specs under the hood. So what are we talking? Well, for starters, it's got the latest Whiskey Lake CPU from Intel, in this case the Core i7-8560U. It's a quad-core design with 8 threads. You've also got 16GB of RAM, a 256GB NVMe SSD, and an NVIDIA GeForce MX 150 discrete GPU. While we're at it, Razer is offering 2 other models of the Blade Stealth. I happen to have the mid-tier version, but the max they offer is a graphics 4K model that costs $1,900. Now we're slowly starting to see brands implement this type of graphics card into their Ultrabooks just to give a little bit of a boost in terms of performance, but is it really worth spending $1,600 on something like the Stealth? Let's find out. But first, a quick message from our sponsor.
The new OCZ TR200 from Toshiba is a great value SSD if you're considering upgrading your hard drive and get a nice boost in performance with cutting-edge 3D flash memory and ultra-reliable controller with built-in power management. Available in different capacities, check it out below.
Now, as some of you know, I recently switched my primary editing notebook to the Razer Blade 15 base. I actually did a full review on it, so if you're interested in checking that out, I'll leave a link right over here. But basically, our CS coverage was mostly edited and rendered on that notebook, and it did not crash for once, which I'm very grateful for. And my overall experience with the notebook has been pretty amazing so far. Now, the new Stealth is a complete design overhaul from the previous generation. If you recall, that model featured rounded corners, thick bezels, and it just wasn't an attractive design. The 2019 version looks a lot like a mini Blade 15 with the boxy design around the edges, the super thin bezels with a webcam placed at the right location. Kudos, Razer. Now, the logo at the front doesn't come backlit like the 15-inch, but rather Razer has implemented this tone-on-tone logo that looks sleek at certain angles. I don't think you'll have any issues bringing this to an office meeting or something because it does look discreet, and I like that. Razer hasn't sacrificed build quality with the new Stealth as well. The chassis is still constructed out of CNC anodized aluminum, and it feels amazing. Seriously, this is one of the best built Ultrabooks that I've tested so far. Port selection is respectable, so on the right-hand side you get a Type-C Thunderbolt 3 port and a USB 3.1 Type-A port. Switching to the left, there's a standard USB 3.1 Type-C connector, which does not support Thunderbolt, so keep that in mind. There is another USB 3.1 Type-A port and a headphone/mic jack. The notebook does charge via USB Type-C, and you can plug it into either one of these ports. The lack of an SD card reader is a bummer though. Moving on to the display, it features a 13.3-inch 1080p IPS panel at 60Hz, and the screen is matte. It supports 100% of the sRGB color spectrum, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time browsing the web and doing some other casual things like watching the latest season of the Grand Tour. The color reproduction is excellent. You really can't complain about it. The brightness levels could be improved a little bit since I did have some trouble viewing content outdoors, but it is adequate enough to get the job done. Now, this whole reduction in bezels have not only reduced the form factor of the new Stealth, but it's actually quite smaller than the previous generation, which is awesome. Now, this whole bezel-less approach is expected to be a 2019 thing. So, every notebook that's coming out in the market, whether that's gaming oriented or not, has to have minimal bezels because it's starting to become the norm, and I don't think I have anything to complain about that because it sort of immerses you to the content that you're consuming. Now, I do have to mention that Razer does offer a 4K display option with the Razer Blade Stealth, and I think that's utterly pointless because 4K on a 13.3-inch display is, first of all, very difficult to drive with the given hardware configuration that we have, and it also affects battery life, and if you want to actually view content, you have to scale the display to 150% or a little bit higher just so you can see things because it's so small. So I'd highly recommend staying away from that model because, it's just pointless. Moving on to the keyboard, and the layout hasn't changed that much from the previous generation, except this time you do lose the per key chroma lighting. Instead, it comes with a unified lighting solution that does cause some bleed around the keys. On the positive side, the secondary keys are backlit, so that's nice. The keys do exhibit a respectable amount of travel distance. It's certainly not as good as Lenovo's or HP's offerings, but you know what, it gets the job done. Now, if you recall my review of the Razer Blade 15 base model, I did talk about the arrow keys positioned awkwardly. It's the same case for the Razer Blade Stealth. They're the same size as the rest of the keys, and I've run into many instances where I would accidentally, hit the left or the right shift key instead of the front arrow key. So it's a little bit confusing, certainly get some time used to, but yeah, I'm just overall not a fan of this keyboard layout, especially on the right hand side. Now, another interesting, or I guess other weird implementation is the power button. It's actually a physical key and not something that's separated from the keyboard layout. So yeah, I mean, I wish if Razer implemented a dedicated power button just like what's found in the previous generation Stealth model. The trackpad is really good. The glass surface is very smooth for navigating around. They still use Windows position drivers, so you'll be able to take advantage of all the gestures baked into Windows 10, so that's nice. There are two front-facing speakers on the new Stealth, and they're positioned appropriately for the best audio projection. Now, in terms of audio quality, it's actually amazing for an Ultrabook. There's fantastic definition in the higher ends. I will mention that the bass is a little bit on the minimal side. It's very underpowering, so you're not going to feel the drop when you're listening to music or something like that. But honestly, for just getting stuff done and just listening to a few casual tunes, this is phenomenal. Moving on to the most interesting part, performance. Now, one thing to keep note of is that the Stealth isn't a fully loaded gaming notebook. Think of it as a hybrid between gaming and portability in a 13.3-inch form factor. Naturally, you should keep your expectations low. So first up, I ran Cinebench R15. I got a multi-core score of 658 and a single-core score of 189. I need to mention that the single-core performance on the Razer Blade Stealth is phenomenal. It actually is a lot better than my 15-inch Razer Blade base model because clock speeds can hit easily up to 4.5 gigahertz, and I've clearly witnessed that as I was monitoring the clock speeds. Video editing is not the best in terms of rendering, but playback at half resolution was actually pretty smooth with 4K GH5 footage. It's also pretty odd too. Even with hardware encoding enabled, the system took well over 40 minutes to render the video. So I think it's more of an optimization issue because when I looked at the stats, or when I was monitoring CPU resources, the CPU was not fully utilized, but rather the integrated GPU and the MX150 were at 100%. So I feel like Adobe has to somehow optimize that. Again, it's really odd, but I wouldn't use this notebook for video editing because the rendering performance is pretty terrible. But for photo editing and other casual stuff, it's amazing. Moving on to gaming performance, and I'm going to kick things off with Fortnite because it's quite the popular game right now. So at 1080p set to low settings, the Stealth averaged around 70 frames per second. Battlefield 1 at 1080p set to low averaged around 56.9 frames per second, so it's relatively playable. Overwatch at 1080p set to low averaged around 124 frames per second. Doom at 1080p set to low averaged around 45.6 frames per second. So it's okay. It's definitely not the best experience. Now, in terms of temperatures, the CPU idled around 40 C and the clock speeds were hovering around 1.8 to 3 gigahertz. In certain scenarios, a few cores clocked all the way up to 4.5 gigahertz, so it's well within the spec. Now, under load, the CPU hovered around 70 C, but by default, the system locked all the cores at roughly 3 gigahertz, which is very respectable for an Ultrabook, if you ask me. I even monitored clock speeds while rendering a 4K video using Adobe Media Encoder, and the frequencies were reaching 4.5 gigahertz, as I mentioned earlier, without a problem, so that's awesome. The system also does a really good job dissipating the heat, so most of the exhaust is right at the back, so it doesn't actually feel, you won't be able to feel the heat while you're gaming on it. Fan noise is also respectable. What's really awesome is during idle scenarios, the fans actually completely stop spinning, which is kind of amazing because you basically won't be able to hear anything. But when you're actually gaming on it, you're going to be hearing them ramp up eventually, and you can control the fan speed through Razer Synapse. And lastly, I do want to talk about battery life. So the new Stealth features a 53.1 watt-hour battery, and it lasted for around 6 hours and 48 minutes, or around 7 hours under my light load test, which consists of refreshing a web page for 15 seconds. And then during my heavy load test, which consists of running real bench on a loop until the battery completely died, the system lasted for around 2 hours. So it's definitely not the best battery life on an Ultrabook. I've seen other Ultrabooks featuring 11 plus hours on just my light load test. So definitely keep that in mind. Battery life is not the Stealth's forte. On the positive side, the included AC adapter is very compact, so you can easily toss this in your backpack and you won't even feel the weight because it doesn't take that much space. All right, so concluding thoughts on the new Razer Blade Stealth. Guys, I really like this laptop. I mean, for one, the design is very discreet, and if I were a student, I would absolutely be rocking this, to classes and whatnot. But after looking at the price tag, I wouldn't pay $1,600 for a notebook of this caliber, because for perspective, to put things in perspective, the Razer Blade 15 base model costs the exact same price, but you're getting better specs like a GTX 1060 Max Q, an 8th gen, a Core i7 6-core 12-thread CPU, and better specs, like just better overall specs with that regard. However, do keep in mind that this is the mid-tier version with the MX150 GPU. Razer does offer the standard Stealth with just the integrated graphics for $300 less. So if you feel like that's a compelling option, then it's a great buy, provided that you really know what you're getting into, because obviously you have your own priorities. If you're looking for a notebook with the best gaming performance, the Stealth is completely out of line. You really shouldn't go for it. But if you're just someone who's looking for a clean laptop that can just get work done, like basic stuff like web browsing or content consuming and whatnot, then I would actually recommend the base model Stealth over the mid-tier version, because I don't think the MX150 GPU is going to come of that big of a use in that regard. Now, if you compare the Stealth to something like the XPS 13 or HP Spectre X360 or even Lenovo's X1 Carbon, the benefit of considering the Stealth is that you're getting the MX150 discrete GPU, provided that it's adequate enough for your needs. I think customer support is also something that needs to be considered, since Razer isn't really well known for that compared to Dell, for instance. And so that about wraps up my experience using the Razer Blade Stealth. Guys, let me know what you guys think about the Razer Blade Stealth and the fact that Razer was able to implement an MX150 GPU. What do you guys think about it? Because I know it's not a fantastic gaming GPU, and it's definitely not as close to a GTX 1050 or whatnot, but do you think it's worth implementing on an Ultrabook, especially for a notebook of this size? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Ibar with Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out some relevant content over here. Subscribe to our Boost Sequence channel. I'm signing off, and I'll see you guys in the next one.